Somewhere above the forum, past the marble anyone would recognize, a staircase climbs into the dark. It is narrow, and it does not stop at a reasonable height. It keeps going, past the floor where a senator might live, past the floor where a shopkeeper might live. It climbs on, up toward a room barely large enough to lie down in. A woman climbs it now, carrying water on her shoulder, because no pipe reaches this high. Somewhere below her, the city goes on being Rome. Up here, Rome is just the stairs and the wait and the next step. This is the world underneath the one everyone already pictures. The legions are real. The marble is real. But almost no one who lived here ever stood in the Colosseum's shadow or watched an eagle standard pass. Most days were spent in a rented room, in a line for grain, in a street too loud to sleep through. They were spent waiting for a landlord who might not fix the roof before it came down on someone's head. What unfolds from here follows the people the monuments were never built to remember. It moves through kitchens that were never kitchens, because no insula trusted its tenants with fire. Through shrines at the crossroads where a slave and a shopkeeper could stand as equals once a year. Through the specific, ordinary work of staying alive in the largest city the ancient world ever built. If you find this kind of patient, immersive exploration meaningful, a like and a subscription help the next story get made. Sharing with a single person who thinks this way is the most powerful thing you can do. Let your shoulders lower, the way they might at the end of a long climb. Let the noise of your own day fade the way Rome's carts once waited for nightfall. And let the picture in your mind soften, floor by floor, down to street level. This is Rome at street level. The stairs do not stop where a reasonable building would stop. They turn past the 4th floor, past the 5th, past any landing wide enough to rest on. The poet Marshall once climbed 200 of them to reach a single rented room, a cellar barely large enough to lie down in. 200 steps works out to something close to 40 meters above the street. That is nearly 3 times the height Augustus had legally capped a building at. He had set that limit after earlier collapses made it necessary. Height limits existed on paper. Enforcement did not. A landlord who wanted more rentable floors simply built them, story after story, past whatever the law allowed. No one was checking. Whoever paid for that top room paid the least and climbed the most every single day. There was no rails sturdy enough to trust, and no one coming to fix that. By the 4th century, the city's own surveyors had counted this kind of building block by block. The count told an uncomfortable story about what Rome actually was. Something near 46,600 insulae stood inside the walls. Fewer than 1,800 domus stood beside them, the freestanding single-family mansions most people still picture when they imagine Roman housing. The ratio was not close. For every elite house with its private garden and its atrium open to the sky, there stood roughly 26 apartment blocks stacked with renters. Most Romans never owned a floor, let alone a house. They rented a room in a building owned by someone they likely never met. This was the shape of the city, repeated block after block, whether anyone pictured it that way or not. An entire population lived inside an arrangement that left almost no trace of ownership behind. Only tenancy remained, passed from renter to renter, long after any record of the original builder had faded. The word for that building did not always mean the same thing. Early insulae were modest. 2 or 3 stories of timber framing raised over a row of shop fronts at street level. Rising land prices changed that. Chronic demand for housing changed that. Concrete changed that, and brick facing changed it further. The same word, insular, came to describe towers of 5, 6, sometimes 8 stories. Each one was built to hold as many tenants as the site could bear. A visitor centuries apart would have heard the identical word used for 2 very different buildings. One was a flimsy walk-up. The other was a genuine tower block. There was no way to know which one a stranger was about to enter. The buildings that survive today skew toward the sturdier, later kind. The earlier, shoddier ones simply burned or collapsed and left nothing behind to excavate. Inside the Aurelian walls, all of this pressed into a footprint of just under 14 square kilometers. Population density there reached an estimated 100,000 people per square kilometer. That is a figure historians usually reach for only when describing 19th century industrial slums. It is a figure that also describes the most crowded pockets of a city like Mumbai today. Stacking buildings upward was the only way to fit a population, approaching 1 million inside walls that size. But this was not density the way a modern high-rise city is dense. There were no fire codes here, no sanitation standards, no structural inspections standing between a tenant and the building's own worst instincts. The number alone sounds almost administrative. Lived inside, it meant a city pressed shoulder to shoulder, floor to floor, with nothing underneath the crowding to catch anyone if it failed. Feeding a population that size required its own machinery, and Augustus built it as a formal office around 7 years before the Common Era. The Praefectus Annonae answered for the flow of grain through the deep-water ports at Ostia and Portus. By the 1st century, something close to 200,000 adult male citizens received a monthly ration through that office. Each ration ran to 5 modii of raw wheat, close to 30 kilograms, collected with a physical token called a tessera. The state imported an estimated 10 million modia of grain every year, just to keep that dole running. It drew on Egypt, on North Africa, on Sicily, wherever ships could reach. This made the prefecture one of the most powerful posts in the entire empire. Failure there did not mean an embarrassing shortfall on a ledger. It meant hundreds of thousands of Romans going hungry within weeks. Food security was not a policy question in Rome. It was political survival, measured 1 shipload at a time. That same crowd needed somewhere to gather, and the building most people picture is the wrong one. The Colosseum held roughly 50,000 people, and it was not even finished until the year 70. The Circus Maximus held between 150,000 and 250,000, 3 to 5 times as many. It had stood for centuries before that. Chariot racing filled it, organized around 4 fiercely loyal color factions: red, green, blue, and white. Crowds followed it with the kind of intensity modern audiences bring to a stadium final. It was also one of the only Roman venues where men and women sat together without separation. Its sheer scale gave the crowd something rarer still, a collective voice loud enough to shout demands directly at the emperor himself. The Colosseum, more segregated and more carefully managed, never offered that kind of mass political voice in quite the same way. The phrase that describes this kind of crowd has drifted a long way from where it started. Juvenal coined bread and circuses around the year 100 in his 10th satire. Today, the phrase gets aimed at governments accused of distracting citizens from their own failures. That is not what Juvenal meant. He was attacking the citizens themselves. In his eyes, Romans had once held real political power, electing consuls, commanding legions, shaping the state directly. He believed they had traded all of that away for the comfort of a grain ration and a free seat at the races. The insult was his contempt for ordinary people who accepted comfort in place of power. Centuries later, that same phrase now criticizes the powerful for offering the distraction in the first place. The target has fully reversed itself, without the words changing at all. Not every enclave inside the walls answered to Rome's institutions in quite the same way, and Trastevere across the river held on to its own for generations. A durable Syrian and Jewish community settled there, keeping its own institutions and its own religious life intact inside the larger city. Cicero himself once remarked on the size and the political cohesion of Rome's Jewish assembly in the year 59 before the Common Era. The state, rather than suppressing that cohesion, formally worked around it. Caesar allowed Jewish residents to collect their own temple tax without interference. Augustus went further still, letting Jewish recipients of the grain dole collect their ration on an alternate day whenever the regular distribution fell on the Sabbath. A city otherwise organized around uniform rules made a specific, lasting exception here. It was one small accommodation folded quietly into a system built to feed everyone the same way. For all its careful counting, though, the state's own numbers left most of that population out entirely. Official figures counted adult male citizens because the census existed for military levy and for taxation. Neither purpose had any reason to count anyone else accurately, so neither purpose ever tried. A count built to raise an army and collect a tax simply had no use for a name that couldn't be conscripted or billed. Women went uncounted. Children went uncounted. The enslaved went uncounted. The people missing from that ledger were the same people doing much of the city's actual daily labor. They were also doing much of its reproduction besides the quiet, unrecorded work of simply keeping the population alive from one generation into the next. Later historians, reaching back for a picture of daily Roman life, inherited a document that had never once been designed to hold it. That gap in the count has never closed, and historians still argue over what the real number of people was. The disagreement is not a minor one. The census itself was never built to answer that question, so the argument has nowhere solid to stand. One school of thought reads Augustus's surviving figures as counting all free citizens. That reading arrives at something like 4 to 5 million people across Italy. A second school reads the identical figures as counting adult males only. That reading would put the real number past 10 million, more than double the first estimate, from the exact same surviving numbers. Neither side has ever settled the dispute, and nothing in the record allows either one to win outright. The enslaved population, estimated at 10 to 20% of the empire, falls almost entirely outside either count on either reading. Most of the city's actual population, in other words, simply never existed on paper at all. Whatever the true number was, the city could not have sustained it on its own. Isotopic analysis of teeth and bone recovered from imperial-era cemeteries, sites like Casal Bertoni among them, shows a population in constant motion. Urban mortality in Rome was catastrophic enough that the city could not reproduce its own numbers through birth alone. It required a continuous influx of new people just to stay the size it was. Free migrants arrived from across the empire, alongside a steady stream of the enslaved brought in from elsewhere. Rome was never a stable native population, quietly renewing itself, generation after generation. It was closer to a constantly replenished intake, absorbing outsiders simply to remain what it already was. Most people living inside those walls, or their parents before them, had come from somewhere else entirely. And the state that prided itself on its careful accounting had never once managed to count them. 750 liters of water delivered every day for every person inside the walls. Spoken aloud, the number sounds like abundance, the kind of figure a city might carve into a monument to itself. The aqueducts made it true at street level, where public fountains ran constantly, fed by channels carried in from hills far outside the city. But the number describes the city as a whole, not any single household inside it. Ground floor tenants drew from the fountains directly. Everyone above them lived at the mercy of the stairs. No insula, however tall, carried plumbing up past its lowest floor. Someone still had to fetch every liter by hand, then carry it upward, flight after flight. That work fell most often to water carriers and enslaved household staff. Just as often, it fell to the women and children of a family with no one else to spare. The number sounded generous at the level of the whole city. At the level of a single staircase, it meant a chore repeated daily by whoever had been assigned to carry it. The system meant to deliver that water was also quietly being robbed by the men who maintained it. Rome's water commissioner, Frontinus, ran a formal audit of the aqueduct network and found organized theft running through it. A query, the workers trusted to keep the channels running, had been puncturing the mains themselves. They installed illegal private pipes, diverting water to paying customers in exchange for bribes. On the Aqua Appia alone, Frontinus measured the actual flow at over 1,800 quinare. The official recorded output for that channel was just 841. More than half of it had vanished before it ever reached the public. The same pattern repeated empire-wide. Nearly 10,000 quinarii of flow across the whole network could not be accounted for at all. The Aqua Appia was not an isolated case. It was one measurable instance of theft built into the very system Rome pointed to as proof of its own competence. That same grain-fed city depended on a second system, further downstream, to turn what the water carried into something edible. Ostia's Caseggiato dei Mulini, the House of the Millstones, still shows the industrial scale that system reached. Volcanic millstones stood in rows, turned by mules kept deliberately blindfolded so they would walk their circuit without resistance. Stone kneading machines followed, fitted with rotating blades built to do by force what human hands once did alone. Domed ovens completed the process, some stretching 5 meters across, wide enough to bake for a neighborhood at once. This scale existed because the state's grain dole delivered raw wheat, not bread, and insular apartments had no hearth safe enough to bake in. Milling and baking had to happen elsewhere, at a scale no household could manage alone. Enslaved workers ran that machinery directly, turning raw grain into the loaves that fed Rome's poor. The bread was ordinary, eaten without a second thought. The labor behind it was punishing, performed by hands most citizens never saw. Clean clothing came from a different kind of labor, one that started barefoot in a shallow tub. Fullones stood in water mixed with stale urine, trampling wool and linen underfoot to work the dirt loose. There was no soap in the workshop, nothing chemical to cut through grease and grime. Ammonia was the only thing available that worked reliably, and urine, left to age and decay, produced it on its own. Once the cloth came clean, it went onto a wicker frame stretched over a low fire of burning sulfur. The fumes bleached the fabric white in a haze that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. This was constant, close contact with waste, heat, and choking smoke, hour after hour, in a cramped room built for exactly this work and nothing gentler. And yet the trade carried real standing, not shame. Fullones belonged to a recognized guild, a collegium with its own patron deity, Minerva. The guild had its own symbol too, an owl, marking the craft the way any respectable trade marked itself with an emblem. The Emperor Vespasian went further still, placing a formal tax on the urine collected from Rome's public latrines. What most people would call waste, the state treated as a taxable commercial good, a resource moving through the economy with a price attached to it. The men who processed that resource were guildsmen, recognized under Roman law, not outcasts working outside it. Their trade had its own festivals, its own collective identity, its own place in the civic order most Romans took for granted. Foul, physically taxing labor and formal civic recognition sat side by side without contradiction in the way Rome organized the trades that kept its people clothed. Not every essential worker got their hands dirty in quite the same way. Scribes and clerks carried their own kit through the city, small and specific to the job. Bone spatulas smoothed wax tablets clean, ready to be written on again. A compass, called a cercinus, ruled straight lines across a page before a single word was set down. Pumice stone prepared the surface of fresh parchment, scraping it fine enough to hold ink evenly across the page. Sponges waited nearby for the moment a line needed erasing and rewriting. And the most sensitive documents traveled the city in sealed leather cases, called graffiaria or theca calamaria, kept secure as a clerk carried them on foot. This was the working toolkit behind Rome's actual paperwork, carried daily by the hands that kept the empire's records moving. Those hands mattered more than the men who employed them liked to admit. Magistrates were elected to brief, single-year terms, arriving in office with authority, but often without any real knowledge of how the treasury actually worked. The permanent scribae staffed beneath them held the institutional memory the elected men lacked entirely. They alone knew which archive held which record, which procedure unlocked which fund, and a new magistrate depended on them completely just to function in office. The dependency bred resentment rather than gratitude. Aristocrats viewed these low-born insiders with open suspicion, calling them parvenus, upstarts, who had worked their way toward power without earning the berth for it. A private sector version of the same work existed too, quietly, inside wealthy households where amanuenses, often Greek slaves or freedmen, performed the identical labor for aristocratic families. The city ran on men the ruling class needed constantly and quietly despised. Even willing labor had limits the weather itself set, and no employer could argue with rain. The agricultural writer Columella counted the actual working days available to construction labor across a full year, and the number came to roughly 290. Rain halted work outright, since wet mortar refused to bond and slick scaffolding turned a building site lethal. Freezing temperatures did the same, stopping concrete from curing properly and stone from setting the way it needed to. For a day laborer, this wasn't a policy decision or a wage dispute to be argued over. It was simply the arithmetic of the season, indifferent to anyone's need for income. No work meant no pay, and there was no cushion built into the system for the days the sky decided otherwise. Ostia still shows visitors some of the best preserved apartment blocks anywhere in the Roman world, brick-faced and solid, rising several stories intact after 2,000 years. But that survival tells a skewed story. These buildings date from strict codes imposed after Nero's fire, when Rome finally forced construction toward brick-faced concrete and away from timber and mud brick. The shoddier, more dangerous buildings that came before those codes simply didn't last long enough to be found by archaeologists centuries later. They collapsed, burned, or were torn down and replaced, leaving almost nothing behind for anyone to excavate. What survives at Ostia, then, is the housing of people who weren't living in the worst of it. The most precarious tenement life, left the least physical trace of all, buried under everything sturdier that came after it and simply outlasted it in the ground. Daylight in the city carried its own noise, though even that had rules. Julius Caesar's Lex Julia Municipalis banned heavy commercial wagons from Rome's streets during daylight hours, meant to ease the congestion choking the roads. But a ban doesn't remove noise, it only moves it. Deliveries simply shifted to nighttime instead. The rumble of wagon wheels over stone, along with the shouting of drivers navigating narrow streets in the dark, became the new soundtrack of sleep. Juvenal complained bitterly that the noise made rest impossible for anyone without money. The wealthy could afford detached houses, set back from the street, buffered from the worst of it. Martial complained of the same chronic insomnia. For the poor living directly above the thoroughfares in a rented room, sleep became something close to a luxury. It was available only to those who could pay to escape the street below. The street itself carried a danger that had nothing to do with wagons or noise. Upper-story tenants routinely emptied chamber pots and threw broken pottery straight out the window into the street below. Roman law took this seriously enough to legislate it directly. The digest's rule on thrown or poured objects held the primary tenant of an apartment strictly liable for anything that fell from it. A guest, a slave, the tenant themselves, it made no difference under the law. The penalty could run to double damages, or a fine of 50,000 sesterces if the object killed a free person walking below. Simply walking through Rome at night carried a real, legally anticipated risk of being struck and killed by someone else's household waste. It could fall from several stories up without any warning at all. Fire was a danger no law could fully contain, and for centuries Rome had no real answer to it. Before Augustus, fighting fires was either private extortion or a political stunt, and neither served the ordinary person burning inside a collapsing building. Marcus Licinius Crassus ran the extortion version, a private brigade that arrived at a burning building and simply waited. It refused to act until the desperate owner agreed to sell at a fraction of its value. An aedile named Marcus Ignatius Rufus ran the opposite version, a free brigade of 600 slaves. It won him such popularity among ordinary Romans that he used it to win election to praetor. Augustus recognized the danger in both approaches. A private militia controlling something as essential as firefighting was a power base waiting to be exploited by whoever held it, for extortion or for votes. In 6 of the Common Era, he founded the Vigiles Urbani as a public institution. It removed firefighting from private hands permanently, placing it under state control instead. The vigiles that emerged were built around specialized, physical roles. Siphonari operated bronze force pumps, capable of shooting water 20 to 30 meters into the air, high enough to reach a burning upper floor. Aquarii organized bucket brigades, relaying water hand to hand from the nearest source. Immersive laid mattresses below windows to catch anyone forced to jump, or smothered flames directly with water-soaked quilts called centones. Each cohort also included 4 doctors and a chaplain who maintained the cult of Vulcan and Vesta, medical and religious care built directly into a firefighting unit. When water alone couldn't stop a fire's spread, the vigiles resorted to tearing down neighboring buildings by force. Pickaxes did the work, and sometimes military siege engines cutting a fire break straight through the block. Beyond fighting fires, they doubled as Rome's nighttime police, patrolling the dark streets hunting arsonists and runaway slaves alike. At its peak, the city Rome had built saw an estimated 100 fires every single day. Densely packed timber-framed insulae stood shoulder to shoulder across the city. Nearly every home relied on open flame for light and heat, with almost no oversight of how safely any of it was built. Fire in Rome wasn't a rare catastrophe that struck occasionally and left a lasting scar on memory. It was baseline, ambient, something every resident lived inside constantly. It was feared only occasionally, the way a person stops noticing a sound that never actually stops. The vigiles hadn't been built to prevent an emergency that might someday arrive. They had been built to manage one that never actually stopped arriving, day after day, cohort after cohort, for as long as the city stood. That same absence of protection shaped who could become a citizen at all. The Lex Aelia Sentia, passed in 4 of the Common Era, permanently blocked certain freed slaves from ever gaining full citizenship. If a slave had been freed too young, or by an owner who was themselves too young under the law, the freedom granted was real but incomplete. These people became known as Junian Latins, occupying a permanent legal middle ground between slavery and full Roman citizenship, neither fully bound nor fully free. Among the several restrictions that came bundled with this status, a Junian Latin could not even write a legally binding will. Whatever they had built across a working life could not be formally passed to a chosen heir. Whatever small property or savings a lifetime of labor produced simply had nowhere legal to go. A person could be freed, could work, could save, and could still die with no legal way to say where any of it should go. A child's tooth, pulled from a burial pit outside the walls, holds a record no census ever kept. Inside its enamel, laid down layer by layer while the child was still alive, isotopes mark where that child grew and what it ate. They mark how its body struggled. Across cemeteries like this one, researchers have gone looking for signs of what Roman engineering was supposed to deliver. Clean water moved by aqueduct. Waste carried off by sewer. Bathing made public and constant. The soil says otherwise. Sediment pulled from Roman-era latrines and burial ground shows intestinal parasites increasing after conquest, not falling away. Whipworm. Roundworm. The organisms behind amoebic dysentery. All of it more common in Roman layers than in the ground beneath them. The mechanism was hiding inside the very success the engineering represented. Waste from the city's latrines was carted out to surrounding farmland, spread as fertilizer for the crops that fed Rome. But it was rarely left to compost long enough to kill what lived inside it. Worm eggs survived the journey from latrine to field to harvest. They rode the grain and vegetables straight back into the people who had produced the waste in the first place. The sewer didn't remove the threat. It recirculated it. Along the northern frontier, at a fort called Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, soldiers lived with communal latrines and proper drainage. It was the same engineering the empire was proud of everywhere else. More than a quarter of the latrine sediment tested there carried roundworm or whipworm eggs, often alongside a parasite called giardia. Men supposedly protected by Roman sanitation were losing weight and losing fitness from infections the system was meant to prevent. The pattern wasn't unique to that one fort. Similar signs turned up at other military postings, men living by the same rules, catching the same organisms. Even the baths, the most visible symbol of Roman hygiene, told a similar story. Their water wasn't changed often, and dirt and bacteria built up in it season after season. Archaeologists compared flea and lice levels in Roman-era soil in York to layers left centuries later in the medieval period. The numbers were the same. Bathing left no measurable advantage against these particular pests. Trade carried its own quiet hazard. Garum, the fermented fish sauce shipped across the empire in sealed jars, carried something else inside it too. The broad fish tapeworm traveled with it, spreading from a handful of regions to at least 6 others. At some Roman sites in Italy, as many as 80% of buried children show the skeletal signs of severe anemia. Parasitic infection could easily explain it. Physicians of the time were not blind to the worms themselves. Galen and others documented them, found them, described them. But the explanation available to Roman medicine held that worms simply appeared out of decaying matter on their own. No host or outside cause was needed. Treatment followed that same reasoning: bloodletting, dietary changes, remedies meant to cool or dry the body's humors. None of it touched the parasites causing the damage. Some of it likely made a weakened patient weaker still. The numbers used to describe a Roman life carry their own kind of concealment. It starts with a single, often repeated figure. 20 to 30 years, historians say, when asked how long a Roman could expect to live. The number is accurate, and it is also almost useless for describing any one person's actual life. It's an average, and averages flatten the different fates hiding inside them. Roughly 30% of infants born in Rome died before their first birthday. By the time a child reached 10, the toll had climbed close to half. That single fact does most of the work of dragging the average down. Demographers use tools borrowed from population science, model life tables built to separate childhood death from the lifespan of survivors. Run the numbers that way, and a different Rome appears. A person who survived long enough to reach the age of 20 had already outlived the years that killed so many others. They could reasonably expect to live into their 50s or 60s. The statistic that sounds like a short, brutal life for everyone is really a statistic about a brutal filter at the start. Once through, the odds changed completely. This reshapes what life expectancy of 25 actually describes. It isn't the expected span of an adult Roman's life at all. It's the blunt average of an entire population. That average is weighted down by a mortality event concentrated almost entirely in the first 10 years. It describes almost no one's real, lived experience once they'd cleared it. There was a second risk running underneath all of this, one that belonged to women specifically. It rarely made it into the standard statistic at all. Each birth carried its own chance of killing the mother, somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. On its own, across one pregnancy, the number looks small. But Roman women didn't give birth once. Repeated across a full childbearing life, that risk compounded birth after birth. It layered on top of every other danger a Roman body already faced. It's a mortality risk carried by half the population, almost invisible in a single average. Left out of the standard figure, it quietly lowered the real life expectancy of women relative to men. The tidy number never shows that on its own. Along one of the roads leading out of Rome stands a tomb unlike any other built in the ancient city. It wasn't raised by a senator or a general. Marcus Vigilius Euryzaces had once been enslaved. By the time he died, sometime around 30 years before the Common Era, he had become a contractor supplying bread to the Roman state. He was wealthy enough to commission a monument that still stands today. He built it in the shape of his own machinery. Round openings marching across its surface echo the grain measures used to portion out wheat. Other sections mirror the drums of a mechanical kneading machine. It was the very device that turned flour and water into dough. His workshops baked that dough by the thousands of loaves. A carved frieze wraps around the tomb, showing his workers at each stage of the process. It shows grinding grain, kneading dough, weighing the finished bread. State inspectors checked that bread before it reached the public dole. Freedmen like Euryzaces were barred from the offices and honors that came naturally to freeborn citizens. The Senate would never have seated him. Rome's traditional elite regarded trades like his, working with the hands, as beneath a person of real standing. That was true, however much money the trade produced. Euryzaces built his answer in travertine stone on a public road. Every person entering or leaving the city would pass it. It wasn't apology. It was insistence. A man the official channels of Roman honor had shut out, built himself a monument, carved with the very machinery of the work he refused to be ashamed of. Not every monument to a working woman survives in stone, shaped like a tool. Some survive simply because someone paid for the marble and had a name carved into it. Aurelia Nace worked as a fishmonger, selling from a stall in a city that needed feeding every day. By the time she died, she was remembered with an elegant marble monument. It was funded by her former enslaver and a fellow freedman who thought her worth the expense. Coelia Massalina left a different kind of record. Her name appears stamped directly into bronze, identifying her as an importer of wine and oil in her own right. Those goods moved by ship and cart across the empire under her name, not a husband's or a patron's. Both women had once been enslaved. Both built commercial lives substantial enough to leave a lasting trace. Their trades had nothing to do with domestic service or a household's private needs. They were buying and selling in the same public markets as anyone else in the city. The record they left behind proves it. Further up the scale of Roman commerce, other freedwomen built businesses that had nothing modest about them. Celia Epira worked on the Sacred Way, one of the most prestigious streets in Rome. She made clothing embroidered with actual gold thread for clients who could afford it. This was luxury work, sold in a location that mattered as much as the craftsmanship itself. On the Aventine Hill, a freedwoman named Gaevia Philomena ran a business remembered as genuinely profitable. She operated independently, with no household or master's name attached to explain her presence there. Neither woman needed the frame of a domestic role to justify her place in Rome's economy. They ran enterprises in the same commercial spaces used by the wealthiest merchants in the city. Even enslaved women could hold a kind of legal standing that looks, from a distance, almost like ownership. Roman law recognized something called a peculium, a fund of money an enslaved person could accumulate. She could control it even while still legally the property of someone else. A seamstress named Daphne worked within the powerful Statilii household, taking in sewing and mending as her own recognized trade. When a client's clothing came back ruined, Roman law allowed that client to sue directly against Daphne's peculium. It treated her personal funds as the responsible party, not her enslaver's estate. Martia Prima, a freed needlewoman working near the Six Altars, ran the same kind of small enterprise once free. The law didn't erase the difference between bondage and freedom. But inside that difference, it still made room for a woman to be recognized as running something of her own. She was answerable in her own name for the work she did. Freedom itself came with strings most people never hear about. A former enslaver freeing someone under Roman law rarely let go completely. The new libertus or liberta typically owed operae, a set number of days of labor every year. Those days were owed indefinitely, back to the person who had once owned them. Manumission documents often went further still, writing in restraint of trade clauses. These forbade a freed person from opening a competing business anywhere near their former enslaver's own. A man could walk free from the household that once controlled him. He could still find that same household controlling how and where he was allowed to earn a living. Freedom, in practice, was rarely a clean break. It was a renegotiated form of dependency, one that could follow a person for the rest of their working life. Even wealth earned honestly and legally ran into a wall freedmen couldn't climb over. Roman law barred any formerly enslaved man from holding civic magistracy. That held no matter how much money he'd made or how respected he'd become. In Pompeii, a freedman named Papidius Ampliatus found the workaround other wealthy freedmen had already discovered. He funded the rebuilding of the Temple of Isis after an earthquake. He did it in the name of his son, a freeborn boy of 6 who had never been enslaved. That gift bought the boy a council seat waiting for him at manhood. It was a seat his own father, despite paying for the temple, could never legally occupy himself. It was a father spending a fortune to purchase, for his child, the one thing his own history would never let him hold. Freed women faced a version of this same wall, built even higher. A man who left slavery behind could, in time, act with real independence. He could build a business, fund a temple, buy his son a future. A woman rarely had that same room to move. Unmarried freed women remained under the lasting legal authority of the person who had once owned them. On top of that legal tether sat a moral code, the Matrona standard. It constrained how a respectable woman was expected to live and appear in public. Together, the two pressures closed off the independent economic and civic life some freedmen still managed to build. The women selling fish, importing wine, and embroidering gold thread on the sacred way had done it anyway. They worked inside constraints their male counterparts never had to face at all. The words that describe most Roman women's working lives never made it into literature at all. They survive instead on stone, cut by families who paid to have a trade carved beside a name. Sarcinatrix, seamstress, ornatrix, hairdresser, obstetrix, midwife, nutrix, wet nurse. These words repeat across hundreds of surviving inscriptions, naming skilled, specialized work Rome's historians almost never mention. The men who wrote the surviving literature of the ancient world wrote about senators, generals, and emperors. Epigraphy. The plain habit of carving a name and a trade onto a tombstone became one of the only windows onto everything they left out. Each of these women, or the families who buried them, made a choice. They could have carved a name alone, or a relationship, a wife, a mother, a daughter. Instead, over and over they chose a trade. It was a claim to professional identity the literary record never offered them. It was made permanent in the one medium that would outlast the culture that ignored them. Behind every well-dressed Roman woman of standing stood another woman whose entire working day disappeared into that appearance. A funerary relief from a town called Numigan preserves the mechanics of it in stone. A seated mistress has her hair arranged while an ornatrix works beside her. Other servants stand ready with a pitcher and a mirror. The scene looks calm, even domestic. The reality behind it moved at the pace of someone else's expectations, hour after hour. Pessimate was an ornatrix enslaved to a woman named Furia, and she died at 18. She was commemorated by her partner, a baker named Mithridates, who had her trade and name remembered together. Behind the composed hair of elite Roman women stood girls like Psamate. Their own short lives were spent almost entirely in service of someone else's reflection. Not every hairdresser worked inside someone else's household. Some built a trade of their own, out in the working city, answering to no mistress at all. Freedwomen named Nostia Daphne and Nostia Cleopatra ran their business along the Vicus Longus. It was a busy commercial street where a hairdresser could find her own paying customers. Another hairdresser, a woman named Gnome Pyrenis, left behind something rarer still. Her epitaph in a columbarium records the exact date of her burial, the 28th of January, 2 years before the Common Era. For an ordinary working woman, that kind of precision almost never survives. Someone who loved her wanted the day itself remembered, not just her name. Midwifery held a status many people today would find surprising for work performed almost entirely by women. The Roman jurist Ulpian classified it formally as medicina, legitimate medicine. He placed it on the same legal footing as the practice of male physicians. At the port town of Ostia, a midwife named Scribonia Attica had her own understanding of what that status meant. Her tomb shows it plainly. She's shown actively delivering a baby, facing outward toward whoever is looking at the tomb. It's a small choice in composition that carries real weight. She wanted to be seen practicing her profession, not simply attending to someone else's body. Beside her tomb worked her husband, a surgeon, the two of them practicing medicine side by side. The named midwives who appear across Roman inscriptions come from strikingly different backgrounds. Enslaved women with Latin names, Secunda, who served a woman named Statilia Maior, worked alongside others bearing Greek names. Imerita and Hilara are among them. A freedwoman named Tadia appears in the record beside a freedman named Anteros. It's evidence of overlapping professional and family networks that rarely survive anywhere else. Elite Roman mothers were often actively discouraged from nursing their own children. The labor of feeding an infant was handed to someone else's body instead. Surviving contracts for wet nurses reveal exactly how closely that body was then controlled. A nutrix was placed on a strict diet, forbidden certain foods believed to spoil her milk. Leeks and garlic were among them. She was also forbidden sex outright for the duration of her contract on the same reasoning. What looks like one of the most intimate relationships a person can have had been converted into closely supervised contracted labor. It was governed by someone else's rules for someone else's convenience. And yet something real seems to have grown out of that arrangement anyway, something the Romans gave its own name. A child nursed by a wet nurse was called her conlactius, her milk sibling. The bond between them could last long after the working relationship that created it had ended. A man named Rotio built a monument not only to himself but to his nurse, a woman named Marciana. He included Verena, the milk sibling who had shared her breast as an infant alongside him. Historians reading that monument today don't agree on what it actually means. Some see it as evidence of real, lasting affection, a family bond that outgrew its origins in bondage. Others read the same inscription as something closer to a mask. It sits over the quieter fact that Marciana had been forced to prioritize someone else's child ahead of her own. Both readings can be true of the same stone. For some nurses, the bond never really ended at all, and the roles blurred together. Sabina nursed a boy who grew up to become a consul, Servius Cornelius Dolabella Metilianus. Decades later, that same boy, by then a powerful man, had her commemorated on the Via Ardeatina. He hadn't forgotten her. Claudia Burrus's epitaph goes even further, naming her for the very same child as both grandmother and nurse in one. The two roles had folded into a single relationship. The family no longer bothered to separate. Care given so completely and for so long that kinship and labor stopped being different things. Turning raw wool into finished thread was some of the most invisible labor in the entire Roman economy, and some of the most punishing. A woman called a lanipendia weighed out the wool and oversaw the spinners working beneath her, the quasilaria. Their hands never really stopped moving. Experimental archaeologists have tried to replicate the process by hand. Spinning a single Roman pound of wool using only a spindle and a distaff takes roughly 180 hours. That is 1 pound, spun by one pair of hands, across more than a week of constant labor. It was spun before it could even be woven into cloth. The great household of the Statilii kept a columbarium, a shared burial place. Its walls preserve the names of the women who did exactly this kind of work, many of them dead young. Italia was a spinner, and she died at 20. She was commemorated by her partner, a bookkeeper named Sceva, who had her trade recorded alongside her name. She wasn't alone in that columbarium. He spun wool there too, and so did Hedone. There was a second woman also named Italia, who worked as a weaver rather than a spinner. An entire workforce remains invisible in every surviving work of Roman literature. It is legible today only because their names were carved into the walls where they were laid to rest. Spinners and weavers remembered by the people who loved them, 20 years old and gone. A sheet of lead, no thicker than a coin, waits in the dark at the bottom of a spring. Someone has scratched a name into its surface and folded it shut. A nail runs straight through the fold, driven there on purpose. It holds the curse closed, the way a door is held closed against something that wants out. The letters run backward, right to left. The person who wrote them believed a life could be undone the same way its words were undone here. Whoever buried this tablet did not write it for anyone to read. They wrote it for the water to keep. Springs and tombs were the favored hiding places for this kind of writing. Both sat at the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beneath it. A curse needed a threshold to cross. The dead could carry a message further than the living could shout one. Moving water was already understood to lead somewhere unseen. A lead tablet dropped into a spring was a message sent to an address no ordinary letter could reach. The nail through the fold was not decoration. It was meant to physically pin the victim's fate in place, the way a steward might pin a notice to a door. Beneath modern Rome, in 1999, workers found exactly this kind of spring. It was dedicated to the goddess Anna Perenna. Inside it sat dozens of lead canisters that no one had disturbed in 2,000 years. Some held wax and flower figures shaped like bound human bodies, dolls made to suffer in place of the person they represented. This was not folk superstition running alongside Roman religion at a polite distance. It was woven directly into it, practiced by people who also kept household shrines and attended the same public festivals as everyone else. One tablet, pulled intact from the mud, names a real man, Quirinus Pistor. Whatever quarrel he was caught in, whoever wanted him bound, the dispute was ordinary enough. No historian would have recorded it by any other means. It survived only because someone hated him enough to write his name down. They threw it into the water and let it wait there. Another tablet from the same spring curses a man named Sura, and it does not ask for anything gentle. It demands his eyes be plucked out. The words on it are not standard Latin ritual formula either. They borrow from Egyptian and Coptic tradition, invoking magic words like Blobes and Irelisus, and calling on the god Seth by name, spelled out as Set. Whoever wrote this had no loyalty to keeping their religion pure or their sources consistent. They wanted the curse to work above all else. If a foreign god carried more weight than a familiar one, a foreign god is who they called. Ritual orthodoxy mattered less than results. Somewhere in Rome, someone's desire to see Sura suffer was strong enough to reach past their own tradition. It pulled in whatever power might actually answer. Not every curse asked for blood. At a different sacred spring, in Bath far to the north, over 100 tablets tell a gentler story. Someone's coins had gone missing, or a cloak, or a ring. Instead of cursing a thief's body, the victim simply gave the stolen object to the goddess Sulis Minerva outright. The theft became her problem now, not theirs. Anyone who possessed that item was automatically guilty of stealing from a god, a crime no ordinary court needed to prove. Suspects were named directly on the tablets: Senesianus, Saturninus, Aniola, accused openly of taking what wasn't theirs. For someone with no access to a magistrate, no money for a lawyer, and no standing to bring a formal case, options were thin. A scratched name and a coin dropped into sacred water was the only small claims court available. It worked because everyone, rich or poor, still feared what a god might do. The law offered its own version of justice, and it was written with a much steadier hand toward the people who already had the most. Roman leasehold required a tenant to hand over movable belongings as security before they ever moved in. Whatever furniture or tools they owned was held as collateral against the rent. Getting those belongings back required an appeal called the interdictum demigrando. It only worked if the rent had been paid in full and nothing pledged remained outstanding. Legal historians who have studied the actual jurisprudence describe it as structurally built to favor the conductor, the primary tenant who sublet rooms to others. It was weighted against the poorer people renting from him in turn. For a family living in a dark, unventilated room with no plumbing and no real recourse, eviction was not a distant risk. It was a legal mechanism built into the walls around them, quietly reinforced every time a landlord needed it. Only once does the record show the state stepping in to interrupt that arrangement. In the chaos of the 40s BCE, civil war unsettled the city and demand for housing outstripped what existed. Rents in Rome and in Ostia were cancelled outright. For a moment, tenants owed nothing at all. Historians who study the episode are careful about what it does and does not prove. It reads as an act of extraordinary political generosity, the kind of gesture a leader makes to be remembered. It is not evidence of any ongoing policy toward renters. Once the crisis passed, the market went back to running itself. Landlords and tenants left exactly where the law had always positioned them. The state had shown, briefly, that it could intervene. It had also shown that it saw no reason to make a habit of it. Plaster walls all over Pompeii carried a different kind of record. Scratched in by hand, meant for no one in particular and everyone at once. One guest at an inn confessed, in his own scrawled letters, that he had wet the bed. There had been no chamber pot in the room, he explained, as though the wall itself deserved the excuse. Elsewhere, someone jabbed at a rival town over its food and its wine, a small act of local pride carved where any passerby could read it. These were not inscriptions built to last for centuries, the way a tomb or a temple dedication was built. They were closer to a passing remark, tossed off and forgotten, the kind of thing that leaves no trace in any formal history. It survived here only by accident, sealed under ash before it had the chance to fade or be painted over. Outside the house of a man named Publius Pacius Proculus, someone left a joke with a longer reach. The graffito names a financial official from Nero's court, calling him Cucuta. The word sits close enough to the Latin for hemlock that the pun could not have been accidental. Nero's reign was already remembered for poison, for sudden deaths in his court explained away as illness. A name like that painted onto a wall would have carried its own private history for anyone reading it. Maybe the joke mocked the deadly reputation of Nero's inner circle. Maybe it mocked some local Pompeian puffing himself up with imperial connections he didn't really have. Scholars still argue over which target the writer actually meant. Either reading needed the same thing to work, a passerby who already knew enough about the man in question to catch the pun instantly. The joke needed no stage and no audience beyond that one moment of recognition. A wall and a well-placed pun were enough. 2,000 years later, the joke still lands. Some of what survived on Pompeii's walls wasn't a joke at all. In 59 CE, a riot broke out between the people of Pompeii and visitors from the neighboring town of Nuceria. It turned deadly. One surviving wall preserves the argument that followed. It was written not in a single sitting but in layers, 3 different hands adding lines over what must have been days or weeks. What started as a toast curdled into an insult aimed squarely at Pompeii itself. Painted campaign slogans from the same election season sit only a short distance away. Beside them, someone scratched a plain curse, wishing a losing candidate ill. None of it was official. All of it was public, a running argument conducted in the open. Anyone with something to add could pick up where the last hand had left off. Not every message on a wall was aimed at a rival or a rioter. One graffito names a specific man and states, plainly, that he was responsible for a pregnancy. It wasn't hidden or coded, and it wasn't written for the man himself to find. It was written where other women would see it, a warning left in a place they were known to pass. It was meant to reach exactly the audience it needed to reach. This challenges an old assumption about who could actually read and write in a Roman city. Historians once pictured literacy as something confined to magistrates, merchants keeping ledgers, and scribes. Whoever wrote this warning assumed her readers could read, and assumed correctly. Literacy here served no formal, official purpose at all. It reached the women writing warnings to other women, using the same public wall the men used for their jokes and their grudges. It served a purpose the men's graffiti never had to serve. A woman named Erato carved 2 words into a wall in the theatre district. Erato loves. Nothing more was needed. Elsewhere, an enslaved woman named Metha left behind a fully formed blessing. She called on Venus of Pompeii to watch over her lover, grammatically confident and entirely her own. For a long time, scholars reading these walls assumed writing belonged to men. They read the evidence accordingly. One inscription, blunt enough that its meaning should never have been in question, states plainly that a man named Atamitis got the writer pregnant. Older scholarship, uncomfortable crediting a woman with writing something so direct, reinterpreted the line as a complaint about a head cold instead. It took decades before that reading was set aside for the obvious one. The wall had said exactly what it meant to say. It simply took longer for anyone to believe a woman had been the one to say it. Rome kept no record of who belonged and who didn't, in the way a modern city might. There was no document proving lawful residence, no line a person could cross without permission. When the state decided it wanted a group gone, it didn't police the roads leading in. It named them directly instead. Worshippers of Isis faced banishment in 1 decade, philosophers in another. At different points, the small early communities of Jews and Christians were ordered out by name rather than turned back at a gate. The same government capable of that kind of mass expulsion also tolerated, in ordinary times, the very groups it sometimes banished. It let them settle, trade, and worship largely undisturbed until the mood in the city shifted again. Belonging in Rome was never a fixed legal status. It was a standing that could be granted, ignored, or revoked, depending entirely on what the moment demanded. An emperor's edict once closed the hot food counters in Rome's taverns, and the official reason was fire. Ovens burning day and night in cramped, crowded popinae were a real hazard in a city that already saw fires constantly. No one needed convincing that an open flame near timber and thatch was dangerous. But the restriction did something more specific than reduce cooking fires. It broke up exactly the kind of gathering a hot meal encouraged. The lingering over stew and wine let a room full of strangers become, gradually, a room full of people talking to each other. A cold counter gave a customer no reason to stay. Rome's rulers had watched crowds gather before, at crossroads shrines, at the baths, in taverns exactly like these. Now and again, they had watched a gathering turn into something closer to an assembly. The fire was real. So was the fear standing just behind it, of the poor finding a warm room and a reason to stay in it together. A slave stands near the threshold of a grand house, before the sun has fully cleared the rooftops. He holds nothing in his hands but a list he has never written down. He carries 1,000 names and the faces that go with them, in memory alone. This is the nomenclator, and his entire function in the household is to make sure his master never has to ask a client who he is. Each morning the atrium fills with men waiting to be received. Some are old friends of the family. Some are strangers hoping to become one. The nomenclator moves ahead of his master's attention. He murmurs each name a half second before it's needed. Greeting a senator, and greeting a shopkeeper's son look from the outside like the same effortless recognition. A patron who fumbled a name in public lost more than a moment of composure. He lost standing. So the memory belonged to someone else, quietly, permanently, and without credit. This ritual had a name of its own, the salutatio, the first transaction of the Roman day, conducted before most of the city had eaten. Clients traveled from wherever they lived, sometimes crossing half of Rome, to stand in another man's atrium and be seen standing there. A patron distributed a small daily allowance in exchange for the visit, for the flattery, for simply adding to the size of the morning crowd. The allowance was coins, or a basket of food called the sportula. For a client with no other income, this walk to a patron's door wasn't a courtesy. It was how the day's bread got paid for. The size of the crowd in that atrium was read, by everyone watching, as a public measurement of the patron's importance. A thin morning meant a man was losing influence. A packed one meant the opposite, and everyone in the room knew they were part of the display either way. Long before that crowd arrived, before the door had opened, a much smaller ritual had already taken place inside the house. Every home in Rome, whatever its size, kept a small shrine near the hearth or just inside the entrance, and every morning it received an offering. The gods who lived there were called the lares, and they weren't imagined as distant, marble-featured Olympians. They were shown as a pair of young men, cheerful, caught mid-dance, each holding a drinking horn raised as if toasting the household itself. A bit of food went to them. A splash of wine. This happened in the grandest domus on the hill and in the cheapest rented room above a bakery. The lares didn't distinguish between rich houses and poor ones. They protected the place, not the class of person living in it. It was the one form of religious observance in Rome that touched every single household in the city, every single day, without exception. Outside those private thresholds, the same instinct scaled up into something communal. Rome's neighborhoods, roughly 265 of them by one count, each centered on a crossroads. Each crossroads had its own small shrine to the lares of that intersection. These shrines were tended by officials called vicomagistri, elected locally and drawn heavily from freedmen. These were men who had once been enslaved and now held one of the only positions of visible civic responsibility open to them. Rome's Senate had no room for a freedman. A crossroads shrine did. Twice a year, at a festival called the Compitalia, the whole neighborhood gathered around that shrine. The gathering itself became powerful enough that Roman authorities eventually grew wary of it. They worried a crowd bound together by shared devotion might also become a crowd bound together by shared grievance. Augustus, when he reorganized the city, folded his own household spirit into these local shrines. He attached the emperor's presence to a religious practice that had begun entirely from the ground up. Not every sacred site in Rome sat above something clean. Where the city's great sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, emptied into the Forum, a small round shrine stood directly over the outflow. It was dedicated to a goddess called Cloacina, a figure of both filth and its cleansing, later folded into the identity of Venus herself. Anyone walking past would have caught the smell before they noticed the shrine, and that was, in its way, the point. Rome didn't hide its sewage. or treat the machinery that carried it away as something to be ashamed of. It sanctified it. A goddess stood watch over the exact place where the city's waste met its most public square. Keeping that system running wasn't considered beneath the god's attention. It was considered necessary to the survival of everyone walking above it and worth their gratitude in return. Steam rose from the same pools for everyone. Rome's public baths were among the only places where a senator and a street vendor might occupy the same water at the same hour. By afternoon, the halls filled with people from every level of the city's ladder. But the equality stopped at the surface. A wealthy bather arrived, trailing a small retinue of enslaved attendants. One guarded the folded clothes from theft. One carried towels and oil. One scraped the skin clean afterward with a curved bronze strigil. A poor bather arrived alone, undressed alone, and left his clothes to whatever luck the crowded changing room offered. The same room, the same heat, the same water performed differently depending on who could afford to bring an entourage into it. Underneath the shared steam and the shared noise, the baths still sorted people exactly the way the rest of the city did. They just did it more quietly, without a wall or a gate to mark the line. Evening drew the same divide out further. In a wealthy household, the family reclined on couches around a low table, propped on one elbow. They worked through courses that might include imported delicacies like dormice rolled in honey. In a rented room above a shop, there was often no way to cook at all. Insular apartments rarely had a working hearth. An open flame that high above the street was one collapse or one gust away from becoming the next fire the whole block would remember. The poor ate what the street sold, or they ate pulse, a thick porridge of emmer wheat. It was plain and filling, and the same meal eaten the night before. Some historians have modeled the calories behind a standard ration given to enslaved workers. They found it fell well under 2,000 calories a day. The physical labor demanded of that same body could easily require twice that. The gap between what a laboring body burned and what it was fed wasn't hidden. It was simply someone else's decision to close or not. For the many who couldn't cook and couldn't afford a wealthy household's table, the popina filled the space between. It was a small open-fronted shop with an L-shaped counter. Jars of wine and stew sat sunk into holes along its surface, serving anyone willing to stand or perch on a low stool. It fed an enormous share of the city's population. People with no hearth and no kitchen, and no other reliable way to eat a hot meal. Elite writers described it with real contempt. The satirist Juvenal catalogued the Popina's Ostian regulars as thieves, sailors, hired killers, and runaway slaves. To him, it was a den to be avoided, not a public service to be acknowledged. The people who actually depended on it, night after night, left no writing behind to answer him. The counter kept serving regardless of what the literate class thought it represented. Getting to that counter, or to the baths, or to the salutatio, meant moving through streets that made rank visible in motion itself. A wealthy Roman traveled by litter, carried above the crowd on the shoulders of enslaved bearers. Runners went ahead to physically clear a path and stop oncoming carts. Everyone else picked their way along raised stepping stones set into the road. The stones were placed there specifically so pedestrians could cross without wading through the filth that ran between them. The stones themselves were a kind of quiet confession. The street beneath them was assumed to be foul enough that a person needed a deliberate, engineered way to avoid touching it directly. Movement through Rome was never neutral. Whether a person floated above the crowd or stepped carefully between the stones told everyone watching exactly where that person stood. Cicero himself, writing on proper conduct, dismissed crafts and wage labor outright as sordid professions. They were beneath a respectable man's attention, he argued, with landowning as the only truly dignified path to wealth. It was a tidy hierarchy, and it was also simply wrong about how most of Rome actually lived and worked. The tradesmen who built the city's actual economy left their own answer carved in stone. Their funerary monuments, commissioned in their own words and their own imagery, showed the tools of their trade displayed with open pride rather than shame. Bakers stood proud of their ovens. Builders stood proud of their measuring instruments. Cicero's contempt was the view from one house on one hill. The monuments were the view from everywhere else, and they didn't agree with him. Cicero's own fortune, in fact, depended on exactly the kind of property he preferred not to discuss too openly. He managed a genuine rental empire across the city, collapsing slums alongside prestige addresses, but kept his own name at a careful distance from the collection process. A primary tenant handled the subletting. An educated slave handled the accounts. The profits still reached him, but the unpleasant work of extracting rent from Rome's poorest tenants happened through other hands, leaving his public reputation untouched by what his private ledgers actually recorded. Marcus Licinius Crassus built a fortune from the same gap between image and reality, though he never bothered hiding his method behind other hands. He kept a private brigade of roughly 500 enslaved architects and builders. When a building caught fire, he brought that brigade to the scene and did nothing. The owner, watching flames climb toward a total loss, would eventually agree to sell the burning property for a fraction of its worth. Only then did Crassus's men move in, extinguish what was left, and rebuild it for resale at a real profit. It wasn't his first use of the same instinct. Years earlier, during the Sullan proscriptions, the state had condemned wealthy citizens as enemies and stripped their property for sale. Crassus had bought aggressively at those same distressed prices, turning a political purge into an early fortune. It was the same method he'd later turn a fire into, run through the same mind toward the same outcome, a generation apart. Rome had promised its citizens order, protection, a city that looked after its own. Crassus understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how much profit lived in the space between that promise and what the city actually delivered. Somewhere above the Forum, the stairs have gone quiet for the night. The water has been carried. The lamp has been lit. What remains, now that the climbing is done, is only the shape of the city that made it necessary in the first place. Rome was never one city. It was always two, folded into the same streets, the same hours, the same stone. One Rome kept a ledger of what it wanted remembered, the grain distributed, the water flowing, the fires answered. The other Rome did the remembering itself, in names carved by hand into tombs no senator would ever pass, in a wall scratched with a warning meant for one woman to find. The marble told one story. The stairs told the truer one. There is no single moment where this city reveals itself entirely. It shows itself sideways in the weight of a jar on someone's shoulder, in a shrine tended by a man who could never hold office, in the quiet arithmetic of a landlord counting what a fire might be worth. None of it asked to be noticed. All of it was necessary anyway. Perhaps that is the oldest pattern any city holds. The version that gets remembered is rarely the version that was lived. Somewhere between the two, in the space the record never quite reaches, an ordinary life goes on doing what it always did. It rises before dawn. It climbs the stairs. It keeps the lamp burning a little longer than it should. The staircase is still there, if you know where to look. It is narrower now, worn smoother by feet that have long since stopped climbing it. But tonight, there is nowhere left to climb. The water has been carried. The lamp can go dark. Let the last of the noise settle into the stone, and let the city at last rest.